It's totally fine. I have a lot more stories.
That you do.
Yeah.
That you do.
Guilty as charged with the stories.
Hello, loyal listeners. Welcome once again to another edition of I've Got Something to Say, the podcast featuring me, Chris Whiting, where I tell stories about my life and you get to listen to them. This week's edition is called What's That? Oh No, Somebody Call the PoPo. So, I was in college and I met a girl and we started dating. And just had a really wonderful time. Turns out years later, we would get married and have 2 kids. And but this story takes place long before that. We were just dating, and I got serious enough where I met her family, and her mother had just recently gotten married, maybe just a month or 2 before our first date. So I got to meet Rhonda's mother, and then I got to meet the mother's husband, new husband, and we'll call him Bill. And Bill and Rhonda's mother had kind of a whirlwind courtship. She worked at a bank, and this guy came in and opened up an account, started banking there. He had just gotten out of prison and had said that someone had killed his own wife and daughter. They got off on a technicality, crime of passion. He went after, killed the guy, spent many years in prison. So he had just gotten out of prison. He was starting to get his life back together, came out, met Rhonda's mother. 6 weeks later, they were married on Halloween, and had just, like I said, once we started dating, they had just been married a few months, so had really just known each other maybe 3 or 4 months. So that was a fairly new relationship as well. And he seemed like a nice fella. He was very good to Rhonda's mother. Nice enough to me, but there were some odd things. There were some red flags sort of right out of the gate. Like, one of the things was he had said that he was legally blind, and he even carried around a cane when I first met him, and Rhonda's mother had to drive him everywhere. And then all of a sudden, somehow his vision got better and he was driving everywhere. And I thought, well, that's odd, but okay, whatever. You know, he made Rhonda's mother very happy. He was always giving her flowers and treating her well, and they'd carpool to work together because they just had the one car. So she worked at the bank, and he was able to get a job as a maintenance guy at some kind of an institution. I think it may have been like a retirement home or something like that. So, they were doing their thing. I was up at school, so they were down in Independence. I was up at Maryville. So I would just see them when, we'd come home for a weekend or something. So it wasn't like we spent too much time together. But they were struggling, as many of us do, for money. And Bill had access to Rhonda's account somehow. So Rhonda was a college student working, trying to save money, and he would pull money out of her account to, like, buy flowers for Rhonda's mother or buy chocolates for her. But all of this money kept disappearing from her account when she would go to take care of things. And he just wouldn't quit doing it. So I talked to her, and she finally decided that she was going to take her money from that bank where her mother worked and put it in another bank where he couldn't access that. So she did, and he got really, really angry about that for whatever reason. And I remember we came home one time, and we went over to visit, and everything seemed fine. The 4 of us were all in the living room, and then Rhonda and her mother went off into the kitchen, and it was just me and Bill sitting there. And I said something, just keeping the small talk going, probably something very witty, I'm assuming. And he just glared at me across the room. And I've been scared many times in my life, but I have never felt fear like when this guy was glaring at me. And I said it again, thinking, well, maybe he didn't hear me, and he was just staring icily through me. And I was sitting on the hearth by the fireplace, and the fireplace tools were next to me. And I vividly remember thinking, okay, if he makes a move, I'm grabbing this fireplace poker, and I'm just going to start swinging. But this is going to be bad. Well, they came back in. Everything seemed fine once again. And that was the last time Carl was odd to me. After that, things got better between he and I. Bill, yes. Thank you. Yeah, so, but other weird things happened. There happened to be a murder across the street from where her mother and Bill lived together. And Rhonda's mom woke up in the middle of the night because she heard, sirens and whatnot over there. And Bill wasn't in the bedroom. And she looked all over the house. He wasn't in the house. Well, she came out on the front porch to see what was happening across the street with all the commotion. Well, here comes Bill walking around from the back of the house carrying his handgun. And she's like, oh my, do you know what's going on over there? What's all the commotion? He's like, yeah, I guess somebody got hurt over there. Something happened. He goes, I just heard the commotion. I didn't know what was going on, and I was just making sure that we were safe. So he said he grabbed his gun and decided to run outside and, scope out the joint, make sure everybody's okay. So I thought, well, that's odd as well. And then I remember Rhonda's mother telling me that when Carl... Let's just go with Carl. That was his real name. I'm not pulling off this Bill thing very well. So we're going to go with Carl. When Carl would pick her up from work and drive her home, he'd often want to drive through Gillum Park. And at the time, there were a lot of murders happening, and they were finding the bodies in Gillum Park. And so he would want to show her, hey, they found another body here. Did you hear about that? They found a body over there. Did you hear about that? So I thought, well, that's interesting. But people are into true crime, right? People, every other TV show is a crime TV show. So it didn't seem all that odd, but a little bit odd to me. So I still had this uneasiness, even though he was being nice to me. Just the fact that he stared daggers through me, that he disappeared when there was some kind of commotion and somebody got hurt or murdered across the street from them, and that he was obsessed with bodies being found in a park. So all of this added up to me just being leery around him. Then we're up at school. We're in Rhonda's dorm room, and she gets a call up in there, and I take it, and it's her sister's husband. And he's like, hey, Chris, I got some weird news for you to tell Rhonda. Carl died. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what happened? And sad for Rhonda's mom, because she really loved the guy. Kind of relieved for myself, just because I felt so uneasy with this whole thing. So Dan tells me, well, here's what happened. He had dropped Rhonda's mom off at work. He went to his work with the car. Then later on in the day, he called Rhonda's mom and said, I'm not feeling good. Is there any way you can have somebody drive you over here and you can take me to the hospital? I don't know why he didn't call an ambulance, but so Rhonda's mom had a coworker take her over to where he worked. They got into the car, which was there because he had dropped her off and taken the car, and she drove him to the hospital. And on the way there, he had a heart attack and died in the car. So when she got to the hospital, he was dead. Tragic. She was very sad. So Dan calls to tell me that, and I pass the information along to Rhonda, and we're sitting up there, and it was probably 45 minutes, an hour later, there's another call, and it's Dan again. This time he sounds really, really shaken up. And I'm like, what is going on? He's like, I don't even know how to tell you this. I'm like, okay, just lay it on me. He goes, okay. All of the aunts came over. All of Rhonda's mom's sisters came over to comfort her and be with her because she just lost her husband. And one of the aunts said to Dan, hey, Carl kept a lot of handguns around here. Rhonda's mom is really upset. It would probably be best if you just went around and see if you can find them, and let's just collect them. And, because she's emotional right now, it wouldn't be good to have those around. So Dan discreetly goes through the bedroom and he finds a couple of guns. He decides to go downstairs and check the car. So he checks the inside of the car, doesn't see anything. He told me he opened up the trunk and he sees a white bed sheet all wrapped up. And he's like, well, that's weird. And then he looks down and sees a foot sticking out from the bed sheet. He lifts it up and there is a dead, naked woman in the trunk of the car. So he goes upstairs, and he's telling me, he's like, I go upstairs and they are all in the room with her. And he goes, how do you break this news to someone? So he gets one of the aunts to come out of the room and he's like, I think we need to call the police. There's a dead body in the trunk of the car. So they call the police. Police come out. Apparently, kind of got tough with Dan, questioning him, as if maybe he had something to do with it. Long story and odd story short, turns out Carl had killed this woman, gunshot to the head. She was working as a prostitute, drug addict. Father was actually part of a police force in the metro area. Just a horribly tragic story. So it didn't get a whole lot of traction in the news for whatever reason. It was on the news for a couple of days and just disappeared. But after that, Rhonda's mom went on a little tour through southern Missouri to try and talk to as many people from Carl's family as she could, just to figure out, the truth of what all had really happened. So turns out he had just a horrible upbringing. His mother was a prostitute from time to time when she really needed money. She was an addict. She abused and mistreated him horribly and made him watch her do some of the horrible things that she did. So this was a guy that was really emotionally bent. Had a lot of issues, obviously, with prostitutes. They never did pin any more murders on him, but I've always wondered with the whole Gillum Park thing if he was responsible for some of those murders, and that's why he was so interested in showing them, to her. And I love Rhonda's mom, and I felt horrible for her in this, and how do you handle something like that? But I found it interesting. She kind of came to a peace with it. And I remember her telling me years later, what he did was terrible, but the way he grew up was terrible. And I hope, at least for the time that we were together, he knows that he was loved. And I thought, well, now that's about the only way you could make lemonade out of that bag of lemons there. So it's not a story I tell often, and people are often incredulous when they hear it, that can't be true. Hand to heart, that is a true story, and probably the oddest one that I've ever been at least involved in from the sidelines. So anyway, my ex-mother-in-law is a saint for just being the kind of person that she is. I'm sorry she had to deal with that. And what just a crazy, crazy story that was. So that does it for this edition of I've Got Something to Say. Hey, thanks so much for listening. Really appreciate it. As always, big thanks to the folks at KCTK Radio for making this happen. Love being here in the studios of KCTK. Thank you, Paul. And I will talk to y'all the next time.